Clara felt invisible, a pale ghost haunting the edges of her own life. The charity gala was a vortex of glittering chandeliers and forced laughter, a world constructed by her husband, Richard Sterling, for the sole purpose of his own reflection. He stood at its center, a monument to ambition, his voice booming across the ballroom as he accepted an award for corporate philanthropy. Clara watched from a forgotten table in the corner, a glass of untouched water sweating in her hand. Richard's speech was a masterpiece of curated humility. He thanked his team, the city, the very concept of opportunity itself. He did not thank his wife. It wasn't a surprise, merely another small cut in a tapestry of 1,000 others. For 15 years she had been the silent, unassuming bedrock upon which he had built his gleaming empire, Sterling Corp. She managed the home, raised their children until they left for university, and provided the serene, stable backdrop he required. In return, he treated her like a piece of comfortable, outdated furniture. He finally stepped down from the stage to thunderous applause. He moved through the crowd like a shark, all teeth and predatory grace. He passed her table without a glance, his eyes already fixed on a new prize. A younger woman, his secretary Amber, materialized at his side. She was all sharp angles and a predatory smile of her own, her red dress a slash of defiance against the room's muted elegance. Clara watched them, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She saw the way his hand lingered on the small of Amber's back, the proprietary gleam in his eye. This was more than just his usual casual flirtation. This was a declaration. The air around them crackled with it. Later, as the evening was winding down, Richard finally approached her table. Amber was still attached to his arm, looking down at Clara with an expression of thinly veiled pity. It was the look one gave to a stray animal just before calling animal control. "Clara," Richard began, his voice devoid of any warmth. It was the tone he used for firing underperforming employees. "We need to talk." She simply nodded, her throat too tight to form words. She knew what was coming. She had felt it approaching for months, a distant storm that was now directly overhead. "This isn't working anymore," he said, gesturing vaguely between them. "I need more. I need someone who understands my world, someone vibrant." His eyes flicked to Amber, who preened under his gaze. The insult was as deliberate as a surgeon's scalpel. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled a figure on a check and tore it out, pushing it across the table toward her. It was a disgustingly large sum, enough to buy a house, a car, a new life. It was also an insult of the highest order. "This should be enough to get you started somewhere else," he said, his voice cold and final. "Find a small apartment, something you can manage. My lawyer will be in touch about the rest." He was discarding her like a failed investment, writing her off with a flick of his pen. The public humiliation was the cruelest part. He had chosen this stage, surrounded by his peers and admirers, to utterly demolish her. People at nearby tables were pretending not to watch, their averted eyes a testament to the sheer brutality of the moment. Clara felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, burning into her skin. She was no longer a person, she was a spectacle of pity. She didn't look at the check. She looked at his face, searching for any flicker of the man she had once loved, the young, ambitious dreamer she had married. There was nothing left. Only a cold, hard stranger obsessed with status and power. "I see," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good," Richard said, relieved that there would be no scene. He turned to leave, pulling Amber with him. "We'll have your things sent to you." And just like that, He walked away from 15 years of marriage, leaving her shattered in his wake. Clara sat there for a long time, the noise of the gala fading into a dull roar. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie of someone else's life falling apart. Her fingers fumbled in her small evening bag, searching for something, anything to hold on to. They closed around a small, worn object. It was an old, leather-bound notebook no bigger than her palm. Its cover was soft and creased with age. Her father had given it to her on her 18th birthday, just before he passed away. He had been a quiet, intensely private man, an accountant who had always seemed content with a simple life. He had told her to keep it safe, that it held the key to her security, but she had never understood what he meant. Inside, on the first page, was a single entry written in his neat, precise hand. It was a name, Mr. Alastair, and a phone number. For years it had been just a memento, a relic of a beloved parent. Tonight, sitting amidst the wreckage of her life, it felt like something more. It felt like a lifeline. She clutched the little book as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved around her. The 15 years of her marriage to Richard had been a slow, methodical erosion of her soul. When they first met, he had been charming, full of grand dreams and a burning ambition that she had mistaken for passion. She, a quiet librarian who had just lost her father, was drawn to his energy, his certainty. He had promised her the world, and she, naive and grieving, had believed him. In the early years his ambition was a shared project. She supported him, working 2 jobs while he finished his business degree. She believed in his vision for Sterling Corp, a boutique investment firm that he swore would revolutionize the industry. She was his first investor, giving him the entirety of the modest inheritance her father had left her. It was enough to rent a small office and print business cards. He was grateful then, or at least he performed gratitude well. But as the company grew, a subtle shift occurred. His success became solely his own. Her initial contribution was forgotten, then trivialized, then erased from the corporate mythology altogether. She became the wife, a supporting role with no lines. His condescension started as small jabs disguised as jokes. He'd mock her simple taste in clothes, her love of old books, her disinterest in corporate warfare. Clara lives in her own little fairy tale world, he would tell their new, wealthy friends with a patronizing chuckle. It's charming, really. She was his pet, his quaint little hobby, a symbol of the humble beginnings he had so thoroughly transcended. He took control of their finances with an iron fist. He claimed it was to simplify things for her, to free her from the burden of worrying about money. He gave her a weekly allowance, deposited into a separate account, an amount that was generous for a college student, but insulting for the wife of a CEO. She had to ask for permission to make any significant purchase, a process that was always humiliating. He would scrutinize her requests, demanding justification for a new coat or a gift for a friend, making her feel like a child begging for a toy. Meanwhile, Sterling Corp was exploding. Richard was hailed as a financial prodigy. He was ruthless, clever, and had an uncanny ability to secure massive lines of credit. He expanded aggressively, acquiring smaller firms, venturing into real estate development, and building a skyscraper downtown that bore his name in gleaming silver letters. The Sterling Tower was his monument to himself, and he worshipped at its altar daily. His cruelty escalated with his net worth. He began to flaunt his affairs, bringing his assistants on business trips, leaving their hotel receipts on his dresser for her to find. It was a power play, a way to remind her of her own powerlessness. He knew she wouldn't leave. Where would she go? He had systematically isolated her from her old friends and convinced her that she was incapable of surviving in the world without him. Now he had Amber. Amber was different. She wasn't just a fleeting affair, she was his reflection. She was as hungry, as immoral, and as obsessed with the trappings of wealth as he was. In the weeks after the gala, Richard and Amber were inseparable, their smiling faces plastered across society pages. They were the new power couple. He moved her into their penthouse, the home Clara had painstakingly decorated, while Clara's belongings were unceremoniously packed into boxes and sent to a storage unit. Richard was soaring on a wave of supreme overconfidence. He had just secured the largest loan in his company's history, a staggering sum that would finance a massive international expansion. He bragged about it to a financial news reporter, calling it a testament to the banking world's unshakable faith in his vision. He felt untouchable, a king surveying his domain. The thought of Clara barely crossed his mind, and when it did, it was with a vague sense of pity. The poor, simple woman. He had done her a favor by setting her free. Clara, in a small, rented apartment that smelled of fresh paint, felt anything but free. She felt numb. For days, she did nothing but sit by the window, watching the city move on without her. The little leather notebook sat on her bedside table, a silent invitation. The humiliation at the gala had been a devastating blow, but it had also been a catalyst. It had cauterized a wound that had been bleeding slowly for 15 years. The pain was gone, replaced by a strange, cold clarity. Richard believed she was weak, worthless, and utterly dependent. He had spent a decade and a half reinforcing that belief, hammering it into her until she, too, had started to believe it. But he was wrong. He had no idea who she really was. He had no idea who her father really was. On the 5th day in her new apartment, she picked up her phone. Her hands were steady. She opened the little notebook to the first page. The ink faded, but the letters still clear. Mr. Alistair. With a deep breath, she dialed the number. An older, calm voice answered on the second ring. Alistair speaking. "Hello," Clara said, her own voice sounding foreign to her. "My name is Clara Sterling. My father was John Miller. He gave me this number. He told me to call if I ever needed help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft, warm sigh. "Clara," the voice said, full of a kindness she hadn't heard in years, "I have been waiting for your call for a very long time. When can you come in?" The offices of Alistair, Finch and Thorne were not in a gleaming downtown skyscraper. They were housed in a discreet, ivy-covered brownstone in the city's oldest and most prestigious neighborhood. There was no sign, only a small, polished brass plaque next to the heavy oak door. It was a place that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Clara was buzzed in and led by a silent assistant down a hallway lined with antique maps. The air smelled of old leather and lemon polish. She was shown into a corner office that felt more like a university professor's study than a lawyer's workspace. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, even though it was the middle of spring. Mr. Alistair rose from behind a large mahogany desk. He was older than she expected, with a shock of white hair and kind, intelligent eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with a surprising agility, coming around the desk to shake her hand warmly. "Clara, it is a true honor to finally meet you," he said, his voice the same calm, reassuring tone she had heard on the phone. "Your father was my dearest friend. I am so sorry for your loss, even after all these years." He gestured for her to sit in one of the plush leather armchairs by the fire. He sat opposite her, not behind the intimidating desk, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt a sense of ease. "You said my father told you to call if you needed help," Alistair began gently. "I assume that time has come." Clara nodded, taking a steadying breath. She told him everything. She told him about the 15 years of marriage, Richard's ambition turning to cruelty, the constant belittling, the financial control, and the final brutal humiliation at the gala. She spoke without tears, her voice flat and emotionless, as if reciting facts from a history book. Alistair listened patiently, his expression never changing. He nodded occasionally, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. "Richard Sterling?" Alistair said, his voice now holding a new, harder edge. "Yes, we are familiar with him." "He is a man of considerable leverage." "He thinks I'm nothing," Clara said quietly. "He thinks I'm a fool who he could just cast aside with a check." "Well," Alistair said, a faint smile touching his lips, "he is in for a rather significant surprise." He stood and walked over to a large, ornate safe concealed behind a tapestry. He worked the combination with practiced ease and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He placed it on the small table between them. "Clara, what do you know about your father's work?" he asked. "He was an accountant," she replied. "He had a small firm. He was very careful with money. He always said that real wealth was quiet." Alistair chuckled. "That sounds just like John." Quiet was his favourite word. He was indeed an accountant. But his firm wasn't exactly small, and his clients were unique. He opened the portfolio. "Your father, Clara, was a quiet genius. He despised the vulgarity of new money, the way people like your husband flaunt their success. He believed that true financial power was invisible, a force that shaped the world from the shadows." He slid a document across the table. It was a corporate charter. The name on it read, Titan Financial Holdings. "Your father didn't work for people," Alistair explained. "He built a bank, not a commercial bank with branches on every corner, but a private, immensely powerful financial institution. Titan Financial is one of the largest private capital lenders in the world. It has assets in excess of $40 billion. Clara stared at the document, the words blurring before her eyes. $40 billion. The number was so vast it was meaningless. It couldn't be real. Her father drove a 10-year-old sedan and lived in a modest suburban home. "But how?" she stammered. "He started with a small inheritance and an incredible mind for market trends," Alistair said. "He made a series of brilliant counterintuitive investments over 4 decades. He built it slowly, carefully, and completely under the radar. He structured it through a labyrinth of shell corporations and holding companies. To the outside world, Titan doesn't even appear to be a single entity." He paused, letting the information sink in. Before he passed away, he put everything into a unique legal structure, a dormant trust. He made me its executor. The trust's sole purpose was to protect and grow the assets until one of 2 conditions was met. Either you reached the age of 50, at which point it would be revealed to you, or you, the sole beneficiary, chose to activate it yourself by contacting me. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "He did it to protect you, Clara. He saw how many people were destroyed by inherited wealth. He wanted you to live a normal life, to find love and happiness based on who you are, not what you have. He wanted to give you a shield, but only when you truly needed it." Clara was speechless, her mind reeling. Her entire life, her entire perception of her father and herself had been upended in a matter of minutes. Alistair seemed to sense her turmoil. He gave her a moment, then slid another document from the portfolio. It was a loan summary. Now for the interesting part, he said, a glint in his eye. As I said, we are familiar with Mr. Sterling. Sterling Corp has been expanding at a reckless pace, fueled by enormous debt. Ambitious men often over-leverage themselves. They become addicted to growth. He tapped a line on the summary with his finger. 3 weeks ago, Sterling Corp secured its largest ever line of credit to finance its new European headquarters. The lender of record is a firm called Argent Capital Partners. Clara looked at him, confused. I don't understand. Alistair's smile widened. Argent Capital Partners is a wholly owned subsidiary of Titan Financial Holdings. Your husband, Clara, just borrowed nearly $1 billion from you. The great revelation settled over the room. It was a truth so immense, so shatteringly ironic, that Clara almost laughed. Richard, the master of the universe, the man who looked down on her from the pinnacle of his self-made empire, had built that empire with her money. His entire world, his skyscraper, his private jet, his smug sense of superiority, it was all financed by the quiet, simple woman he had so carelessly discarded. The foundation of his kingdom was not stone, but sand, and she was the tide that was about to come in. For a moment, all the pain and humiliation of the past 15 years coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of clarity. The patient victim was gone. The sleeping giant was awake. He thinks I'm destitute, she said, her voice a low whisper, but it carried a new weight, a new resonance. He threw a check at me like I was a beggar. Yes, Alistair confirmed, his eyes watching her closely. The dramatic irony is potent. A fire began to burn in Clara's chest, melting away the cold numbness that had encased her heart. It was not a fire of rage, but of resolve. It was the feeling of power, not the loud, arrogant power that Richard craved, but a deep, quiet, tectonic power. The power to right a terrible wrong, the power to restore balance. She looked up from the documents and met Alistair's gaze. Her eyes, which had been clouded with sadness for so long, were now sharp and clear. A decision had been made, deep within her soul. The part of her that had always deferred, always acquiesced, always sought to keep the peace, had died in that ballroom. A new Clara was being born in this quiet, book-lined office. You said my father built a shield for me, she said, her voice steady and firm. I think it's time to see what it can do. Alistair nodded slowly, a look of profound respect on his face. He had been waiting for this moment. He had been waiting for John Miller's daughter to finally claim her birthright. The trust gives you absolute control, Clara, he said, his tone shifting from gentle advisor to strategic partner. Titan Financial is your instrument. The board, the executives, they all answer to you, through me. You need only give the command. This was the decision point. This was the moment she could either retreat back into the shadows or step into the light of her own immense power. There was no hesitation. Richard had made his choice when he humiliated her in front of the world. Now she would make hers. He built his company by taking risks, Clara said, thinking aloud. He prides himself on his ruthlessness. He calls it good business. Indeed, Alistair agreed, and like most men of his type, he believes the rules don't apply to him. He cuts corners, he is arrogant, and arrogance creates vulnerabilities. Clara and Alistair spent the next 4 hours in a strategy session that would have made a military general proud. Alistair, with his encyclopedic knowledge of financial law and the inner workings of Richard's empire, laid out the battlefield. He explained that a direct, hostile move would be messy and might allow Richard to play the victim in the press. The plan had to be more elegant, more surgical. We will not use a sledgehammer Alistair explained, pacing in front of the fireplace. "We will use a scalpel. We will allow his own arrogance to be the agent of his destruction." The nature of the plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Richard's loan agreements with Argent Capital Partners, her company, were hundreds of pages long, filled with complex covenants, stipulations, and clauses. Richard, in his haste and hubris, would have signed them without reading the fine print, leaving that to his underpaid lawyers. Somewhere in that dense legal text there would be a tripwire. Alistair's team had already found it. A small, seemingly innocuous clause, Section 12, subsection B, pertained to the commingling of corporate and personal funds. It was a standard anti-fraud provision. And they had irrefutable proof, thanks to a private investigator they had on retainer, that Richard had used corporate funds to purchase a multi-million-dollar penthouse for Amber. He had disguised it as a corporate asset, but the paper trail was clear. It was a minor breach, but it was a breach nonetheless. According to the terms of the loan, any covenant breach gave the lender the right to initiate a full, unrestricted forensic audit of the borrower's entire operation. It was a loaded gun hidden in plain sight. "The audit will be our entry point," Alistair said, his eyes gleaming. "It will be conducted by our most tenacious team. They are famous for their ability to find irregularities where others see only success. They will paralyze his operations. They will demand every receipt, every email, every record. The process itself will be the beginning of the punishment." Clara felt a grim satisfaction. It was perfect. They wouldn't be attacking him. They would simply be enforcing the contract he himself had signed. They would use his own actions, his own deceit, against him. "And once the audit begins?" she asked. "The first domino falls," Alistair replied. "The news of a forensic audit will make his other creditors nervous. His credit rating will be flagged. We will then use our influence, quietly of course, with the other financial institutions. A word here, a concerned inquiry there. We will create an atmosphere of uncertainty around Sterling Corp. Confidence is the currency of his world, Clara. We are going to bankrupt it." The final step of the initiation was simple. Alistair pushed a single piece of paper across the desk. It was a formal letter addressed to the board of Argent Capital Partners, authorizing the immediate engagement of their top auditing firm to investigate Sterling Corp, citing a potential breach of contract. All it needed was her signature. Clara picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen from the desk. The weight of it felt good in her hand. It felt like the weight of justice. She looked at the signature line. For 15 years she had been Mrs. Richard Sterling, a title, an appendage. Now she signed her own name, Clara Miller, the name of her father, the name of a woman who owned a $40 billion bank. She pushed the signed paper back to Alistair. "Initiate the plan," she said. Her voice did not waver. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning. Richard was in his penthouse office on the top floor of the Sterling Tower, admiring the panoramic view of the city he believed he owned. Amber was massaging his shoulders, whispering sweet nothings about a weekend trip to Monaco. He felt invincible. Then his personal assistant buzzed through on the intercom, her voice tight with anxiety. "Mr. Sterling, there are some people here to see you, from Argent Capital Partners." Richard sighed, annoyed at the interruption. "Tell them to schedule an appointment. I'm busy." "Sir," the assistant stammered, "they say it's not a request, they're auditors." Richard's good mood evaporated. Auditors? He strode out of his office to the reception area. 3 people in severe grey suits stood there, holding briefcases like weapons. The man in the lead, a stern-faced individual with cold, dead eyes, handed him a letter. It was the official notice, a full forensic audit, effective immediately, citing a potential breach of Section 12, subsection B, Richard scanned the words, his initial annoyance turning to a flicker of confusion, then to outright fury. "This is ridiculous," he boomed, his voice echoing in the marble-floored reception area. "A clerical error. My assistant bought a condo with the wrong credit card. It's a trifle. You're going to disrupt my entire company over a trifle?" The lead auditor stared at him, unmoved. "We are bound by the terms of the agreement you signed, Mr. Sterling. We will require a secure workspace and immediate, unrestricted access to all financial records, digital and physical, for Sterling Corp and all its subsidiaries. We will begin at once." Richard spent the next hour on the phone, screaming at his contacts at Argent Capital. But his usual guys, the ones he played golf with, were suddenly unavailable. He was passed down a chain of command to a cold, clipped compliance officer who stonewalled him with bureaucratic jargon. He slammed the phone down in a rage, dismissing the whole affair as a power play by some mid-level bank functionary. He was Richard Sterling. This was a nuisance, nothing more. He would have it quashed by the end of the week. He was wrong. The auditors were not a nuisance. They were a virus. They set up shop in his main conference room, a silent, efficient team that worked with terrifying focus. They requisitioned servers, demanded passwords, and began interviewing his staff. A cloud of fear and suspicion descended over the company. Productivity ground to a halt as employees worried about their own complicity in Richard's famously creative accounting practices. Clara watched the collapse from a distance. Alistair provided her with daily updates. She maintained her quiet routine, visiting the library, taking long walks in the park, meeting a friend for coffee. One afternoon, she was sitting in a small cafe when Richard stormed in. He saw her, and his face twisted into a sneer. He marched over to her table. "Having a nice, quiet life, are we?" he spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "While I'm being harassed by a bunch of glorified accountants over a paperwork error? You have no idea what it's like to deal with real-world problems." Clara looked up at him, her expression one of mild concern. "Oh, Richard, that sounds stressful. Is everything all right at the office?" The dramatic irony was so thick she could taste it. He saw her as a simple-minded creature, completely oblivious, while she was the one pulling the strings of his destruction. His condescension, even now, was breathtaking. "Everything is fine," he snarled, though the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremble in his hand told a different story. He stormed out of the cafe, leaving her to her tea. She took a slow, deliberate sip. The cascade was just beginning. 2 weeks into the audit, the second domino fell. Richard was in a meeting with investors for his new European expansion when his chief financial officer burst in, his face pale. He whispered frantically in Richard's ear. The company's primary operating credit line from another major bank had been suspended, pending the outcome of the Argent audit. Panic began to replace Richard's anger. That credit line was the lifeblood of his daily operations. Without it, he couldn't make payroll. He couldn't pay his suppliers. The news leaked almost immediately. The headline in the financial press was brutal. "Sterling Corp faces liquidity crisis amidst audit." The cascade effect was swift and merciless. The story spooked the market, and Sterling Corp's stock price, which was already wavering, went into a nosedive. It dropped 30% in a single day. Margin calls were triggered on Richard's personal trading accounts, forcing him to sell his own shares at a massive loss just to cover his debts, which only drove the price down further. He became a man besieged. His phone rang incessantly with calls from panicked investors, angry board members, and journalists hungry for a story of a fallen titan. He and Amber barricaded themselves in the penthouse, the curtains drawn. Their relationship, built on the thrill of success and power, began to fracture under the strain. They started bickering, then fighting, blaming each other for their predicament. Richard's attempts at damage control were frantic and ineffective. He tried to secure emergency funding, but the name Sterling had become toxic overnight. The quiet words Alistair had spoken in the right ears had done their work. Every door was closed to him. The banks that had once courted him now wouldn't even take his calls. He was a pariah. The auditors, meanwhile, had found what they were looking for, and it was so much worse than a commingled condo purchase. They had uncovered a systematic pattern of fraud, of inflated asset valuations and sham transactions designed to hide the company's precarious financial position from its lenders. Richard hadn't just breached a minor covenant, he had committed multiple felonies. Alistair called Clara. "We have him," he said, his voice calm but triumphant. "The audit has produced irrefutable evidence of wire fraud and securities fraud. The next step is to present our findings." He informed her that a final mandatory meeting had been called. Richard had been summoned to the headquarters of Argent Capital Partners to discuss the results of the audit. He was told his presence was non-negotiable. "He will expect to negotiate a settlement," Alistair said. "He will not expect you." The setting for the final reckoning was perfect, the main boardroom of Argent Capital Partners. It was a cold, imposing room on the 50th floor with a single massive granite table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Sterling Tower, Richard's now fading monument to himself. Richard and Amber arrived looking haggard but defiant. He had put on his best suit, a last attempt to project an aura of power he no longer possessed. Amber clung to his arm, her face a mask of anxiety. They were met not by the mid-level executives Richard expected, but by the entire board of directors, a grim-faced assembly of the most powerful people in the city. Alistair sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "Richard, thank you for coming," Alistair began, his voice echoing in the silent room. "We have completed our audit of Sterling Corp. The findings are extensive." For the next 20 minutes, the lead auditor presented a cold, factual summary of Richard's financial crimes, complete with slides showing falsified documents and illicit money transfers. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Richard's face went from pale to ashen. The bravado drained out of him, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a trapped animal. When the presentation was over, Alistair spoke again. "Given these findings," he said, his voice like the tolling of a bell, "Argent Capital Partners is exercising its right to call in all outstanding loans effective immediately. Full payment of $1.2 billion is due within 24 hours. It was a death sentence. Richard knew it. He didn't have the money. The company didn't have the money. It was over. The antagonist breakdown began. Richard leapt to his feet, his composure shattering completely. "You can't do this!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "This is a witch hunt. We can make a deal. I'll pay a fine. I'll do anything." He was begging, his desperation stripping away the last veneer of his dignity. Amber, seeing the ship sinking, made her move. "I had nothing to do with this," she cried, pointing a trembling finger at Richard. "He made me do everything. I'm a victim here." As the pathetic scene unfolded, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Clara walked in. She was not the woman they remembered. She wore a simple but exquisitely tailored dark blue dress. Her hair was pulled back elegantly. She moved with a quiet confidence that filled the room. She was flanked by 2 security guards, but it was her presence alone that commanded the attention of every person there. Richard stared at her, his mouth agape. His brain couldn't process what was happening. "Clara? What are you doing here?" Clara walked slowly to the head of the table, standing next to Alistair. She looked directly at Richard, her gaze level and cold. The protagonist revealed all. "Hello, Richard," she said, her voice calm and clear, yet it cut through the atmosphere like a blade. "You seem to be having a bad day." She let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "You spent 15 years treating me like I was invisible. You thought I was simple, weak, and worthless. A piece of furniture you could discard when you found a newer, shinier model." She glanced at Amber, who shrank back as if struck. "But what you didn't know, Richard," she went on, her voice ringing with power, "is that this boardroom you're standing in, this bank that holds your entire empire in its hands, the very money you used to build your monument to yourself, it all belongs to me." Richard's face was a canvas of disbelief and horror. "No, that's impossible. You're nobody." "I am Clara Miller," she declared, "daughter of John Miller, and the sole owner of Titan Financial Holdings, the parent company of Argent Capital Partners." She delivered the final monologue, a devastating summary of his sins. "You built a kingdom of lies on a foundation of my family's money, all while you mocked me for my simplicity. You threw a check at me in a room full of people to humiliate me. You thought money was the only measure of a person's worth. Well, you are about to learn a very hard lesson about that. You are bankrupt, Richard. Not just financially, morally, spiritually. You have nothing left." The truth finally hit him, a physical blow. He staggered back, clutching his chest, a strangled sob escaping his lips. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not the meek woman he had married, but a queen delivering a final, righteous judgment. The final act was swift. "Alistair," Clara said, turning away from the wreck of her ex-husband, "please forward the auditor's report to the district attorney's office. I believe they will find it very interesting." She turned and walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance, leaving Richard to be dealt with by the authorities. She didn't need to see the rest. She heard Amber's hysterical crying and Richard's defeated wails as the doors closed behind her, sealing their fate. The epilogue was not about revenge, but about restoration. The downfall of Richard Sterling was swift and total. Sterling Corp was forced into bankruptcy and liquidated for pennies on the dollar. The Sterling Tower was renamed. Richard was arrested and, facing a mountain of evidence, pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Amber, named as a co-conspirator for her role in hiding assets, received a lighter sentence but lost everything. Her reputation was ruined, her name forever linked to the scandal. She faded back into the obscurity from which she came. The antagonist's final punishment was a quiet cell for him, and a life of public shame for her. Clara, on the other hand, flourished. Taking full control of her father's legacy, she proved to be a natural leader. Guided by Alistair, she steered Titan Financial with a steady hand, but her true passion lay elsewhere. The protagonist's reward was not about indulging in the wealth, but in using it purposefully. She sold the gaudy penthouse Richard had built and used the proceeds to establish the Miller Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing financial aid, legal support, and emotional counseling to women escaping abusive relationships. She created a place of refuge for women who had been made to feel as powerless as she once had. She lived modestly, preferring her quiet apartment to a sprawling mansion, finding joy in her work and her rediscovered sense of self. The victory lap was a quiet one. A year later, she was meeting with an architect to design a new wing for the foundation's main shelter. The architect, a kind, soft-spoken man named David, listened more than he spoke. He was interested in her ideas, her vision for creating a space that felt safe and hopeful. He didn't know who she was, only that she was a woman of substance and compassion. They talked for hours, and for the first time in a very long time, Clara felt the spark of a genuine human connection, one not based on power or money but on mutual respect. It was the beginning of her new, healthy relationship. The closing moral was clear, a lesson forged in the crucible of betrayal and vindication. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or skyscrapers, but in integrity, kindness, and the quiet strength to reclaim one's own life. Richard Sterling had spent his life chasing a vulgar illusion of power, only to discover too late that the real power had been sitting across the dinner table from him all along, patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. True power lies not in what we display to the world, but in the unshakable truth of who we are.